world has the right to its own homeland except white people? Like, what? Tell me, just explain to me how that makes sense.
Whiteness. It's all we seem to be talking about these days, whether it's white pride, white oppression, or a return to good old white traditional values. Funny, really, considering that the idea of whiteness is a relatively new thing in human history. Matter of fact, before the 17th century, there was no such thing as a white race. Now, don't get me wrong, there was and always has been xenophobia, but whiteness as a racial identity was born out of the need to justify the enslavement of others. Yes, indeed. Whiteness was developed in service to colonialism, capitalism, and their child, slavery. And it all started with religion. Let's talk about it. There have been plenty of ways in which we have categorized humanity, and color is actually a recent one. Skin complexion has, of course, always been evident, but in the past, people would categorize themselves through other criteria like religion, etiquette, or even clothing. So, for example, an Englishman of nobility would identify first and foremost as an English or a noble. The other of the time wasn't as defined as it is today, and you can actually see that in early modern writing, where depictions of exoticized characters not only included Africans, but also Italians, Arabs, Indians, and Irish folk. But that all changed with Europe's colonial expansion. See, early 17th century plantations in the West Indies and American colonies largely depended on the labor of European indentured servants. However, brutal treatment on these plantations led to labor shortages. There simply weren't enough servants to whip into submission.
I think it's important for me to note here that indentured servitude greatly differed from the institution of slavery, in that indentured servants weren't personal property of plantation owners. So that meant that after they served their time, they were free, and very important here, their descendants weren't born indentured servants. While most indentured servants were made up of criminals or simply people from lower classes looking to make a living, their status wasn't predetermined by birth and didn't go on forever. It was really their labor rather than their body that was up for sale. Just wanted to make that distinction.
Because indentured servants were still subjects of the crown, they were still entitled to certain protections. And because they were Christian, they couldn't be held indefinitely by law. And because of that, colonies couldn't maximize their profits. So to get around that pesky little problem, colonists looked to Africa. Africans were exempt from the protections of the crown, and by claiming them to be infidels, perpetual enemies of Christian nations, European colonists were able to justify their enslavement as a right, a legal necessity, really. This meant that 17th century plantation owners had indentured servants and enslaved Africans keeping their operations afloat. As Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote in his article, The Case for Reparations, quote, "The enslaved became early America's indispensable working class, fit for maximum exploitation, capable of only minimal resistance." However, with time, plantation owners realized that their bad treatment of indentured Europeans and even more cruel treatment of enslaved Africans could potentially lead to uprisings, so they decided to protect themselves by giving the Christian servants privileges that weren't available to enslaved Africans. Because remember, the Africans were infidels. The whole idea was to give the Christian indentured servants a sense of superiority. Wealthy plantation owners really needed the two groups to stay divided and not unite in rebellion. So they essentially bought off the poor Christians' allegiance because, hey, at the end of the day, at least the crumbs they were getting tasted way better in comparison. But over time, another problem arose. What if Africans decided to become Christians? Because that would mean that they could no longer be considered enemies of the holy faith, right? And on what legal grounds could they be enslaved then? And that's when colonists got creative. When they realized that religion would no longer be able to separate them and indentured Europeans from enslaved Africans, they decided to find that divide elsewhere. They established whiteness as a legal category and started describing it as the privileged class. As historian Theodore Allen said, quote, "The plantation bourgeoisie deliberately extended a privileged status to the white poor of all categories as a means of turning to African slavery as the basis of its system of production." And this proved to be highly effective. Whiteness was wielded as a weapon on a global scale and used to justify the transatlantic slave trade. But not just, it operated at every scale, from the psychological and sociological to the political. As historian and first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago once said, slavery was was not born of racism. Rather, racism was the consequence of slavery. In Haiti, for example, people were grouped into categories with white people, regardless of class, at the top. They even had names to differentiate what kind of white you were. You had the Grand Blanc, the wealthy big whites, the Petit Blanc, the small whites like plantation overseers, and the Blanc Menant, or small-time farmers. Meanwhile, in Latin America, Spanish and Portuguese colonizers developed a caste system to once again place all manner of white folks at the top. As South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun once said, quote, "The two great divisions of society are not the rich and poor, but white and black. And all the former, the poor as well as the rich, belong to the upper class and are respected and treated as equals."
By the way, John C. Calhoun was the 7th Vice President of the United States, and while this quote may make it seem like he cared about the conditions of Black folks, I think he was simply making an observation on a system that he wanted to maintain. Seriously, Mr. Calhoun was a staunch defender of slavery and ardently protected the interests of white Southerners. He himself owned dozens of slaves and argued that slavery was a positive good that benefited both the enslavers and the enslaved. So when speaking about this division, he actively fought to widen it. That all white folks, regardless of wealth, would be superior to Black folks made absolute sense to him. He was really just right next to the point. So close. All that hate really got him looking like a dollar store Ebenezer Scrooge, but anyways.
Whiteness was created in opposition to Blackness, and the religion of whiteness, as W.e.b. Du Bois once called it, demanded reverence and supremacy. Which is why when working class folks came to America, they tried joining that white religion, okay? And distanced themselves as much as they could from the other. You could even say that that pursuit of supremacy, whether in wealth or in the subjugation of sects and peoples, gave shape to Anglo-American society, but I digress. With whiteness established, it managed to persuade those within it that they were in fact the real victims. From painting the enslaved as conspiring monsters intent on destroying their beautiful plantations, or saying all Black men wanted to do was assault white women and all Black women wanted to do was seduce white men, whiteness positioned itself as the victim and kept using that excuse to secure power through laws, institutions, customs, and religion. It mostly, however, secured power through force. And the transatlantic slave trade is but one of many examples, lest we forget the Belgian atrocities in Congo, the bloody conquest of India, the apartheid in South Africa, the genocide of indigenous people in North America, and so on and so forth. Really, the idea of whiteness has, since its beginnings, been intricately linked with the idea of white supremacy, and that pursuit of white supremacy not only gave shape to our history, it still shapes it today. White supremacy isn't something that's just for the most shocking instances of racism. It's a system of social, economic, and structural inequities that was created to touch every aspect of life. It's been allowed to proliferate among the West's institutions and spin an intricate web of laws that have held up systemic oppression. For example, white supremacy justified eugenics. It justified the destruction of progress from the other. And in the 20th century, it managed to center the white experience to such an extent that everything from schooling to housing was done in service to it. White supremacy encompasses so much more than simple bigotry, which I'd say is also evidenced by the fact that it predates the word racism by 80 years. But what's of particular note is that it's always acted out of self-preservation for fear that its political and economic power might decline. See, whiteness isn't fixed, it fluctuates, which is how it's been able to persevere and consolidate power through the years. But that power in turn fuels anxiety, which is why people who find themselves accepted under the white umbrella go to great lengths to protect it. Something we're seeing in full swing, folks. For example, a lot of what drives Elon's reproductive decisions and other such pro-natalists like him is this, the Great Replacement Theory. Coined in 2011 by French author Renaud Camus, it basically states that white European populations at large are being both demographically and culturally replaced by non-whites through mass migration and the fact that Europe's birth rates are declining. But this concept isn't new. Remember how I said that whiteness fluctuates? Well, groups that were previously kept on the margins have been incorporated into the white racial umbrella specifically to combat the so-called Great Replacement. Southern European Catholics, the Irish, and Jews were not always considered white, but over time they became so to push other folks down down and keep the advantages whiteness had in place. Now, it is important to note that thanks to the civil rights movement of the 60s,
And in the aftermath of World War II,
there was for a time outright cultural rejection of white supremacy, but as a political force, it never really went away. So from the end of the 20th century onwards, white people across the political spectrum could pat themselves on the back for not being racist while still enjoying the institutional and structural powers afforded to them by white supremacy. Colorblindness was in, but actually doing the anti-racist work? But the racial reckoning that followed the Black Lives Matter movement of the 2020s forced many white people to either really do that anti-racist work or, hear about it. And I'd wager that that's why we are where we are today. In part, at least. You could say that the current societal shift to the far right is, again, in part backlash to the discourse surrounding equality for all. Though I will say, it is interesting to shout about the decline of white culture while living in a world built by Black hands and African minerals and resources. But again, I digress. Across 3.5 centuries, whiteness has been wielded as a weapon, which is why white supremacy turns to violence, whether in its systems or through its peoples, whenever it feels disenfranchised. And what's worse is that when the dust will settle on everything that's happening right now and that's yet to happen, whiteness will once more selectively forget and then position itself as a victim to the circumstances it manufactured. Again and again and again, because to quote Ta-Nehisi Coates, the idea of blaming some crazed, maniacal monster for the evils of actual men is a familiar theme. It's very hard to accept white supremacy as a structure erected by actual people, as a choice, as an interest, as opposed to a momentary bout of insanity. Momentary indeed. It's just unfortunate that that moment seems to reoccur through time again and again and again in service of an idea that was, in the grand scheme of things, invented like 2 seconds ago. But who knows where it'll go from here. Don't blink, or next thing you know, someone like me will be enveloped in the white umbrella. And that's all for now, folks. As always, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do all the things. Really show your girl some love, okay? But yeah, there's nothing left to say, so until next time, bye!